everyone, this is Professor Benjamin, and in this section, or this session 12, we are going to cover development and globalization. Now, I know that we have already talked about globalization in this class, especially when we talk about ethnicity and we talk about folk and popular culture and what are the downsides of globalization, etc. We also talked about globalization in Chapter 1 in the first session of the semester. So really, this session will deal a little bit more with development rather than globalization, okay? So there is not a textbook chapter related to specifically to development, so it's kind of mixed throughout the entire textbook. Snippets here and there discussed. So there really are, I have a lot of additional readings for you to do in this module. And as always, I have the PowerPoint. There's also this wonderful documentary about the downfalls of development and taking, this video is all about Jamaica, and it talks about how when they were given their independence, from England, and they and then they kind of decided what model they were going to take, whether it was self-sufficiency or international trade. And it's really interesting, all the loans that they had to take out in the World Bank. It's a horrifying situation that Jamaica finds itself in. And they chose the international trade route, and it really has not helped them at all. In fact, Jamaica is in debt so much because of the decision that they took on the development route instead of taking that self-sufficiency versus international trade. And so it's really important for you to understand what the downfalls are, especially when these countries decide to take loans. And these loans, the payback is astronomical, so much that the interest rates are triple what the actual loan value is, and it creates an entire nightmare for these countries that can never dig themselves ever out of debt. And so this is what the film Life in Debt is. Now, it's not readily accessible on any sort of like, you can't find it on Netflix. You can buy it on Amazon, and you can, it is a little costly, but it is a fantastic film. I've always requested the college to get it, but it's been really difficult to do that. So another good one. We also talk about fair trade in this session. So there's a couple, there's a reading and a podcast here about whether letting large companies into fair trade is a good idea. This national self-sufficiency, this talks about that idea of two ways a country can develop is either through international trade or self-sufficiency. This article talks about self-sufficiency. Another one, this is fair trade. The dark side of globalization. This is a good article as well. There's this reading from PBS about gross national happiness. So a lot of times we indicators on how well a country is doing, of course, is by their GDP and their GNI. So their gross domestic product or their GNI, right? And the big issues with this is the fact of that we should be looking at whether the country is happy overall. And there's been a push for this lately, is that asking people in the country through surveys, are you happy? Are you happy with where your country is? Are you happy with what your country is doing or investing in, etc.? So there's been this push for gross national happiness as another indicator to add to how well a country is doing, not just looking at whether they're developed or developing, looking at actually if the people are happy within that country. So there you go. So as always, we have an initial post due by Tuesday, a response post due by Thursday, a quiz due by Sunday, and so you have everything here. I'm just going to briefly walk you through the PowerPoint because the PowerPoint's really good, and I'm just going to briefly walk you through it. For development, and here we go. All right, so a developed country, also known as a more developed country, or MDC, and referred to by the UN as a very highly developed country, has progressed further along the development continuum. A developing country, on the other hand, also frequently called a less developed country, or an LDC, has made some progress towards development, though less than the developed countries. And a lot of the indicators are educational levels, the GDP, the GNI of the country, all of those sorts of things. So geographers divide the world into 2 developed and 7 developing regions. In addition to 9 regions, 3 other distinctive areas can be identified: Japan, South Pacific, which includes Australia and New Zealand, and then Russia. And so here you go. Here's a really great indicator on where countries are on this scale. So this is a really good kind of, I guess, a depiction of where developed and developing countries are. So how do we measure this human development? How do we measure parts of how do we measure whether a country is developed or developing is through a human development index. And this takes into account the standard of living of the country, the life expectancy of the individuals that live in that country, and access to knowledge. So whether they have access to broaden their horizons, etc., through education, through democracy, other things. So these are some of the 3 factors. And then we're going to talk about development in this chapter, and I kind of talked about that briefly, but self-sufficiency or international trade are the 2 routes in which countries move from that less developed to more developed. And so in order for a country to move from less developed to more developed, a lot of times they need to have some sort of independency in order to promote their development. And they usually either do this through international trade or self-sufficiency. One other factor that's really important in this, and I know we've discussed this in the class in the past, is actually women. The freedom of women actually is a really high statistical indicator whether a country moves from developing to developed. And so a lot of countries kind of leave that factor out, but having everyone part of the economy is a really big thing in moving the country from developing to develop. Because remember, if you don't have women as part of your economic powerhouse force, is that you have now excluded a whole entire group of your population from actually helping your country do better. So that's something to take into account. So self-sufficiency is when countries encourage domestic production of goods and discourage foreign ownership of businesses' resources, and protect their businesses from international competition. A lot of people say that it's just impossible for a country to move from developing to developed without having international trade, that they can't do it on their own. They can't live a self-sufficient lifestyle. They actually have to broaden their horizons and leave their country to do business with other people if they plan on moving up from developing to developed. So, on the other hand, international trade opens markets themselves to foreign investment and international markets. So here is the key elements of self-sufficiency path to development include balancing growth, import barriers, and this is an example of self-sufficiency is India, right? But India is starting to see that they have to trade with other countries, and they have now. I mean, if you look, India is now part of the fast fashion trend, right? India is now getting into the market of producing cheap goods. So they are moving away from self-sufficiency. They're finding that it got to them to a certain point of developing, but it hasn't gotten them to develop fully. So this is some issues with India. And this is how they kind of promoted their self-sufficiency. Was they had import licenses, taxes, export limits, currency restrictions, permits, subsidies, quotas, government ownership. All of this played a role in helping them keep that self-sufficiency model to a certain point. And now India is starting to switch over to that international trade. Now that could play a role, is actually having self-sufficiency get you a good foundation to then move to international trade. So there are ways that it can't just be black or white, meaning you can't just take one model or the other model. It actually may be the best bet is to take a combination of both models, so have some self-sufficiency and some international trade. So here are just some other things. Here are some issues with self-sufficiency: is inefficient industries, lack of competitiveness, corruption, black market. So there's a lot of issues that can happen with self-sufficiency model rather than the international trade model. But just relying on other people for goods is also not good. And that's the international trade model. So when you go with international trade, a lot of times you have to invest with foreign investments, right? You have to rely on foreign investments. And there are issues with that, right? There are some problems with what we call FDI, or the foreign direct investment. Does not flow equally around the world. Most FDI both originates from and is invested in developed countries. So a lot of times they won't risk investing in a small country in Africa. Just won't happen. And so this is a big problem, a huge problem. There's also a big problem of loans, is that if you're not a developed country, and you ask for a loan from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, you are looked at in a way where it's exactly what happened in the United States, right? The color of law is that individuals, depending upon what country you're in, are not given those loans, because those loans are have high interest rates the less developed your country is, and then it's almost impossible to pay back the loan. So in order to succeed, you need to take out a loan, but that loan you're never going to be able to repay. So it's almost like you're just setting yourself up for disaster. Big problems with the International Monetary Fund, big issues with the World Bank, lots of issues. When you start digging through the surface, you realize there are a lot of issues with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So there you go. What if you cannot pay back your loan? Then they just keep charging you. They make you take out another loan that has higher interest rates. It's a disaster. So make sure that you read about these structural adjustment programs that they put into place, where you have to pay back your loan over these times with high interest rates. Lots of issues. I mean, it feels like some of us have probably been in those situations before, where you just feel like you can't get out of debt. But imagine you're a country and you're feeling like that. Okay, so here are some really good graphics of the countries that have loans to the World Bank and the amount of those loans. And you can see we have Mexico, we have a lot of areas, China and India, right? Lots of areas that have over $10 billion in loans that they own back to the World Bank. And then you have the value of debt to GNI. So this is a big deal, because that means like you're not bringing enough money that you can pay out. And so big deals, big problems. But a lot of people talk about fair trade, that fair trade could help this, right? Which is investing in those smaller farmers in your countries, or those smaller artisans, paying them fair wages, supporting local. The problem with fair trade is that we would have to do away with our consumer mindsets that we have in the United States, where we like cheap consumered goods. If we want to support other individuals through fair trade, that's the way you're going to go. You're going to pay more money for your goods. You're going to buy less because you have to pay more for it. But you also will have that great conscience when you leave shopping, that you help pay somebody a fair wage along the chain. Big deal. So, buying from smaller farmers, buying fair trade coffee, buying fair trade chocolate, all of these things help these smaller, less developed countries. It also supports women, because a lot of these small artisans in other countries are women. So fair trade, I talk about fair trade in a bunch of slides too. Okay, and then here are steps of progress of development. You have end poverty and hunger is step 1, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, and then you can move into improve maternal health, combat AIDS, malaria and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and then develop a global partnership of development. So there are the 8 steps of progress towards development. Okay, so again, we don't have a textbook chapter reading. I'd like you to really read in depth these slides that I've created, as well as all the additional readings. And I hope you enjoy the content. And if you get a chance, I'm serious, that Life in Debt film is really a wonderful film that walks you through what can happen to countries when they get into debt with the IMF. Big deal. Big issues. And so if you get your hands on it, it's a great film. Great music too. Okay. So have a good week. If you need anything, feel free to reach out.